I didn't plan on becoming obsessed with Africa. But ever since taking a 10-month internship at a newspaper in Uganda after college, I have returned to the fascinating, unpredictable, and maddening continent again and again to report stories. And then she goes on to say something that I found very interesting. Let's see if I can find the page. So, I was writing 800-word news stories that didn't delve deeply into my subject's lives, and they still felt foreign and incomprehensible. I took time to understand what I was beginning to feel intimately, a kinship to Ugandans, a sense that we were far more alike than we were dissimilar. I had to extend to how I undertook my reporting. If I wanted readers to understand that the people I interviewed were not different from them, I needed to practice empathy writing. But then something else also caught my attention, which is the writer's own experiences. I don't have much experience with resisting extremism in my own life. I do not know what it is like to live in a culture of extremes as a black girl who grew up in the deep south in the 1990s. Within days of moving to Alabama, a white woman shouted, "Nigger!" at my father, my brother, and I as we drove past her car at a gas station. My father immediately reversed the car and pulled into the station to ask the woman what exactly she said. She had nothing to say to my father after that. A pack of white boys at my high school in Montgomery, home of the civil rights movement, wore t-shirts, sweaters, whatever they could find, emblazoned with the Confederate flag. I went to an academically rigorous school and had white and black friends, but my relations with my white classmates always had a terminal boundary, past which lay weekend sleepovers and house parties that I could enjoy because it just wasn't done. And so, I became used to the extreme polarity of race where I lived, darting between each end with frequency, but never feeling free to jump off the wagon. She goes on to talk about how they left their church because of similar experiences. And as I was reading a preface to this book, it transported me back to 1994, when I arrived at State College, Pennsylvania. And as a good Christian boy, because my father was a pastor, I went to a church that sounded familiar. It was a Presbyterian church, which is very strange. There are very few of those in America. Very few. So, I walk in, and I sit at a desk, and everybody else moves. And they start squeezing into pews, and I was wondering, what is happening? Of course, needless to say, I never went back the following Sunday, even though the church was only 5 minutes from where I lived. I think many of you, coming from Africa, coming from the continent, can tell stories like that, even in liberal Northampton, right? Experiences with race. What makes you immediately very much aware of who you are as a person, and what that makes you begin to claim your identity in certain ways. And so I wanted to use that as a way of saying a number of things. One of the things that, especially this year when I have been very intensely focused on how to reinvigorate African studies at Smith, one of the things that have preoccupied my mind, and I've raised this with a number of students, is why we don't have African students in African studies classes. And especially if professors are known to kick ass, let me use that language, then African students run away from those classes. Here is part of the problem. In order to be able to confront experiences like the ones the writer is describing in this book, You have to do that from a position of knowledge. You have to be able to stand your ground and from a position of knowledge. And that knowledge can only be found if you do one thing that I'm going to encourage you as African students and as black students to do. Occupy African studies. Occupy African studies. Be present, show up. Make African studies what it ought to be. Heritage students at Smith. Have you heard that term used? Do you know what it means? Perhaps you need to know. Perhaps you need to know. You know, ethnic studies at Smith, let me use ethnic. I wanted to use the word heritage, but I will use ethnic so that we understand each other. So you'll find Korean studies, and you'll find a lot of Korean students in those classes. You will find East Asian studies, and you'll find a lot of Asian students in those classes. You'll find African American studies, you'll find a lot of African American students in those classes. Jewish studies, they are overfilled with Jewish students. African studies, 1 or 2 students. What is the problem? What is the problem? What seems to be the problem? Isn't that something we should think about? I would seriously encourage you to make sure, even if you are doing engineering, whatever it is you are studying, take an African studies class, take an African studies minor, take an African studies major. Okay? I'm proud to announce that we have 3 graduating majors this year. Woo! Please stand up so we can recognize you. I also want to say these 3 students have really pushed me hard to make African studies much more visible, and we are doing that. We are actually in serious discussions about how to reinvigorate the program, probably even create a major, and find ways to make it visibly present at Smith in meaningful ways. I want to say 2 more things besides occupying African studies. Occupy the disciplines. Occupy the disciplines. Bring an Africanist presence into the classes that you take. Don't take things for granted. Otherwise, you'll continue to hear all these things bandied about Africa as if Africa has no people, right? As if Africa is a problem to be solved, right? As if Africans have no agency, right? I still get students that tell me, I'm signing up for your class because I want to learn something about African culture, right? I don't teach African culture because there's nothing called African culture, right? I teach African studies, and I teach African cultures if I do teach cultures, right? Because they are not a monolithic. And in that sense, what I am saying is, and I'm happy to have read statements of intent for students that are signing up for African studies, because we do require them to write that they've said, for me, doing this major has made me think about sociology in a different way. It has made me think about anthropology or economics or government in a different way, just by being in different African studies classes. So in that sense, I also want to encourage you to occupy the disciplines by bringing Africa into those disciplines from a position of knowledge gained by engaging meaningfully with African studies at Smith. We have great professors here, right? Kim, Anna, who actually took African studies classes, and Professor Mwaba, right? And there she is teaching African politics. I'm very proud because Anna Mwaba was a student in my class. I can proudly say I kicked ass. I want you to occupy Smith. I want you to make Africa visibly present at Smith in meaningful ways. Not from a defensive position, because Africa doesn't need to be defended, right? It doesn't need to be defended. So, claim Smith, there's no need to be defensive. And finally, I want to say something about art, because this conference is about art. You know, broadly defined, and I want to define art broadly. Art is one of the basic categorical forms through which we apprehend and understand our realities in time, and under which synchronic and analytic thinking is itself subsumed and put in perspective. So art is not just there for us to enjoy. Art also demands that we put our intellect in trying to understand what it is all about. If we look at art this way, then we no longer need to be defensive about the role of culture and the importance of its study and analysis. So that then when you go to African studies classes, you no longer have to worry about what is African culture, right? Because it's not something that is frozen in time and space. In that sense, when I talk about African arts, I am not confining myself to one particular or specific form of expression. I am talking about art in the broadest application of the word. So African art, I want to encourage you to think about it in terms of not just communicating or sharing and dissemination of knowledge within a community of readers and consumers, but as a form or forms that are united by a set of experiences and interests. Forms that express both possibilities and anxieties that are created by the conditions of its production and distribution. So then the question that comes to my mind is, what does it mean to produce art in exile? And I'm not using exile in the ways in which we tend to use that term. To be outside of your country of birth, to be outside of the communities that have been formative to your identity is to be in exile. It is to be in exile. So we may not think of ourselves that way as students at Smith or as faculty at Smith, but in many ways, we are in exile. And in fact, going back to that book, that is what she's talking about. Going back to Uganda, reconnecting with a culture that's not our own, and at the same time finding a base in our own country of birth, Nigeria. So art has all these possibilities, right? And finally, in closing, I've been, again, forced by my students to do this, and I'm going to do it, which is to say, in the next few weeks, the African Studies program is going to organize a dinner where we can just talk about African studies at Smith and how we can occupy African studies. I thank you very much for inviting me to give opening remarks, and I thank you very much for organizing this event. Thank you.